Hello, I'm Mischievous Marcinacchio, and I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, Amazing Fantasy 15, and all of the annuals, which I say do not count.
Mark, I have gotten to that point, man. I mean, I don't have any money to look for this stuff, but I started looking on my comic shop weekly if an Amazing Fantasy 15 pops up there.
Oh my God, here we go.
And yeah, it's starting, man, which is a problem. And I will say, you probably got the only affordable copy of Amazing Fantasy 15 that's ever appeared on that site, because ever since then, it's been insane pricing. So, that's to say, I'm Dapper Dan Gavosden. Maybe I spend a little bit of extra money on some nice clothes every now and again. And I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, including the annuals, which I definitely say count. But for me, and especially at this pricing, in this economy, and with my job prospects being what they are at the moment, Amazing Fantasy 15 remains a fantasy.
Wow, that is some preamble. Well, welcome to the Amazing Spider Talk, the show where two fans and collectors, some with more fortune than others, uncover the strange, fun, and fascinating history of the Spider-Man comic universe. Thank you for joining us for this review episode of the Amazing Spider Talk.
Yeah, if you want to swing along with us on our journey through Spidey's past, present, and future, as well as my dwindling fortune, subscribe to Amazing Spider Talk on your favorite podcast app and leave us a review to help spread the word about our show.
Dan, you're rich in friends like me. This podcast exists because of the support of our Patreon members. If you want to receive early episodes, exclusive artwork, and keep this podcast going, go to AmazingSpiderTalk.com and consider joining our Patreon.
I love that even when you're trying to console me, you're patting yourself on the back. This is true to your character. But anyway, there we go. Today on the show, Mark and I are going to be discussing Amazing Spider-Man Volume 6, number 47. This issue was written by Zeb Wells. The cover features artwork by John Romita Jr., Scott Hanna, and Marcio Menyz. The interior artwork is by Todd Nauck, colors by Sonia Oback, and of course letters by VC's Joe Caramanga. This issue was first released on April 10th, 2024. And as I'm saying this, I don't know, I read Marcio Menyz did the colors on the cover. I don't even know if that's true. It doesn't look like his work, but I think that's what it was credited as. So I'm going to leave that as it is. Mark, why don't you give us a recap of the events of the interiors of this comic?
Alrighty, Dan. We open in Red Hook, and a psycho with a machete and a hockey mask has a hostage tied up in a chair. The machete man wants the hostage to use his connections to the mayor to link up with Madeline Pryor because she has Ben Reilly. If he doesn't comply, he's going to play Eeny, Meeny, Mutilate Mo. That's one of my favorite games too. But before it's hack and slash time, a voice off page calls out, "Babe, I'm back." The voice belongs to Ben Reilly. Ben's back? Wait, what? Oh, it turns out the knife-wielding psycho is none other than Hallows Eve, that lovable scamp. Eve and Chasm have a loving embrace, and Ben tells her he's found someone who can fix them up once and for all. There's another voice off page, and Eve seems unhappy about who Ben brought with him. But before we can find out who it is, we are whisked off to the Lower East Side. There, Peter is on the phone with MJ, and he wants to know why she's not coming to the thing Aunt Anna has set up. Apparently someone named Shay, who turns out to be the nurse from Ravencroft, has a few details about Anna's release that Peter needs to know about. Sure. Boy, oh boy, Peter gets fewer and fewer social cues these days, doesn't he, Dan? Anyway, before MJ can spell it out for him, Peter sees Shay dressed very much up for a date. Peter hangs up on MJ, and Shay notes that, as per her typical luck, she shows up on a date, and the guy is talking to an ex. Welp. We get a later, and Peter is still explaining himself. He's not great at this stuff, and he's been especially incompetent lately. Shay seems generally okay about it. Dating is supposed to be hard anyway. Okay. We get a later still, and Shay is sharing funny stories about the inmates at Ravencroft, like Hippo and Plant Man. Peter seems legitimately charmed. Shay says that she works with murderers and villains all day, and Peter can sympathize. A waiter asks if they're having dessert, and both say they are. You can do it, Peter! And of course, right on cue, Peter's cell phone goes off, and it's Betty Brant Leeds, saying that she needs Spider-Man because there are men with guns surrounding her. Talk about a buzzkill. Peter has to ditch Shay, but tells her he likes her a lot, and she grumbles. We get some inner monologue from Peter as exposition. Betty is still looking to clear Ned's name after that whole hobgoblin mess. He gets his Spidey suit on and swings into Alphabet City, which used to be a code word for dangerous real estate, but these days you'd be lucky to afford an apartment there. Ain't that the truth? We find Betty hiding behind a counter, flanked by the most generic of bad guys. One of the guys finds her and demands to know if she called the cops. The other guy, who is definitely not Frank Castle, but kind of sort of looks like him, recognizes her as Betty Brant, the woman Roderick Kingsley wants to stay out of his business. Before things get dicier, some webbing gets on his face and pulls him back, and Spidey busts through saying, "Wrong Betty," with a dry, cool wit like that. Anyway, fisticuffs ensue, and after the guys are subdued, Betty wonders why Spidey isn't funnier. Thank you works too. Anyway, Spidey doesn't do jokes when guns are pointed in his friends' faces. Betty said she found the thing that will clear Ned's name, and it's the Winkler Device. Hey! Spidey bemoans hitting the guys who may know its location too hard, but Betty is like, dude, I just said I know where it is. It's here, dummy. Over to Oscorp, and an older guy in a suit is dressing down Doug for spamming the Oscorp email server with a malignant code. Do it, Doug! Get some two-factor authentication, Doug! Doug's friend reminds him that Kurt Connors told Doug not to use his phone near the living brain, but the spamming was just restaurant promotions anyway, so that can't possibly be a living brain thing, right? Well, maybe the free comic book day issue will give us more information. And maybe the living brain is spamming this comic with free comic book ads too. Yay! Back over to Spidey and Betty, and indeed, they found the Winkler Device. Hey! But Betty hears a dog, and what she actually hears is a werewolf. And here's Chasm. Don't call my girl a dog. And with a dry, cool wit like that, he might be a clone of Spider-Man. Spidey calls him Ben, but indeed, he's Chasm now. Long live King Chasm. Eve wants to know who Spidey's friend is, and Chasm says it's the love of his life, Betty Jane. I'll admit it, I chortled. Spidey gets super indignant about getting her name wrong, not so much about her being the love of his life, and then Spidey tells Chasm he needs help, but he's actually getting it courtesy of their new therapist, Queen Goblin. And yeah, Betty, this is as bad as it looks.
All right, Mark, thank you for that awesome recap of the issue. There's not a lot to say about this issue, I think, which is going to kind of like dominate our review of this issue. This, to me, was like a totally average comic. Like, there's nothing like bad about it. There's nothing great about it. I thought it was like a pitch right down the middle, like one of those very standard forgettable issues of Amazing Spider-Man, or even one of the B titles that we might have gotten back in the day. But the one thing I did want to talk about to get the conversation really started here is the art team on this book with Todd Nauck and Sonia Oback, who are kind of guest artists here. And the reason I think this is significant is just kind of like for anybody that's watched the career of Todd Nauck, who has been kind of circling Amazing Spider-Man forever. He's done work in like a ton of different Spider-Man titles. You know, the Barack Obama backup was him, and he's done countless backups here. And like, you just kind of got a feel for the guy that he never got a proper issue of Amazing Spider-Man to like call his own. And he's done all these campaigns with Marvel, and even I have like dinged him on time. I think in like issue 100, somebody asked me who my least favorite Spider-Man artist was, and for some reason I rolled out Todd Nauck's name, which is not to say, like, I've met the guy. He couldn't be nicer. I think his work is totally fine.
Can I cut you off for a second there? Because I just want to say, like, when
go ahead.
Went to New York Comic Con in 2013, it was like one of our first big, it was just me, because I think you might have been in California at that point. And I was circling the room of Artist Alley, and I was like texting you people to talk with. And I said, oh, there's Todd Nauck. And you're just like, ugh. not him. I'm like, oh, okay. So this all tracks very much. You being like, yeah, for some reason I ding the guy. The second I saw like this issue was a Todd Nauck issue, I was like, what is Dan gonna think? Because this Dan has been like, spiting this guy for over 10 years now, and I mean, don't get me wrong. I don't think he's like the world's greatest artist, nor that I feel that this issue was the world's greatest art. But it's totally acceptable comic book art, and I've always found him to be a totally acceptable comic book
Yeah.
artist. So I'm just curious. So anyway, I didn't mean to cut off your.
I guess that's it. Again, I actually think this is a pretty solid
Yeah.
issue of art from him. And I've warmed to him over the years. I think he's definitely put in the work to become a better artist than he used to be. Like my big complaint with him was he was just like a totally acceptable, as you said, comic book artist. I didn't feel like he like did anything particularly notable. Like a lot of his characters looked kind of like copy pasted with the same expressions. There was kind of always this like very particular perspective angle that he approached all of his characters from. And I just was like, man, I want to see this guy do more. Like, even if you look at his commissions, they all feel very samey. And I didn't feel like any of his stories I saw like the work of a real storyteller on the page. Like he felt like a guy you could go to in like a pinch to really like just knock something out like in a quick little bit of time and have it be totally acceptable to the average reader. Like it's not going to, put people off, because it's very like common, totally acceptable comic book art. But then he did a Gwen Stacy like mini series with Christos Gage, which they finally collected in a giant sized. And I loved that. I thought it like, I mean, again, not going to like blow anybody away, but his art there like really evolved. And I thought this is the exact right place for this guy, a sort of nostalgic teenage tale, kind of all ages adventure. And it really warmed me up to him a lot. And, I don't think I ever like disliked the guy. I just wanted a take from him. And to me, this will also like a slight elevation of his work. Like, again, I don't think that this guy is, gonna blow anybody away, but like, I thought that this was really solid, competent, storytelling on the pages of this comic. And that like, he had some solid storytelling to back it up, especially in the action. But I come down to it. I think this is still a fairly average, right down the middle of the road art style for a big two comic. It's not offensive, but it's not going to wow anyone. And on a book like ASM that we're used to regularly being wowed to the point that like we honestly don't talk about the art enough for how good it is. I think Nauck is, maybe like a notch down from where we typically expect our Spider-Man comics.
I mean,
to be.
I would say if this was like the late 80s, early 90s, Todd Nauck would probably have enjoyed a very long, prodigious run on like Web of Spider-Man. I think that's kind of like where the art
Yeah.
is generally. And look, like, I, yeah, I would agree in terms of body of work. He's a notch below, but at the same time, like, now granted, this wasn't like the most complicated of stories that we were reading here, but like, there was no visual confusion for me in this comic, which I can't always say has even
Yeah.
been the case with JR or Ed McGuinness or some of the others that have been on this book over the last year or in change. So like, like I, I understand the idea that like, hey, we gotta, we should always look to elevate the product in every way we can, and but at the same time, like, when I say totally acceptable artwork, I don't mean that in any kind of way as a piece as shade. It's like this is professional artwork is the bottom line. I mean, like, it
Yes.
doesn't have any unique verve to it like you would with JR or like Vincentini or anything like that. But like, like I don't want to discourage Marvel the idea of having professional artists do issues like this from time to time. I think there's a place for it. I'd rather have this than some not to sound like I'm trying to discourage innovation, but I would rather have something like this than some tryout who's like trying to really play around with things and make a name for themselves and ends up drawing a very confusing to follow issue. Like that was not the case here. This kept the chains moving, if you will.
Yeah, I think the one book I think about for that is this guy I really like on Twitter. His art, Eric Kete, and he did that issue with the Scotty Young artwork on the cover with Spider-Man and Deadpool, where they end up, I think, fighting Stilt Man or Stilt Lady in the comic, and it's visually just a nightmarish mess. And like, I love that guy's like commissions and work that he posts on Twitter. But like giving him a full comic to do, it revealed like the real breakdown in like what makes someone a great, pinup artist versus someone as a great comic book artist. And like, I don't know that I would pin a Todd Nauck piece on my wall, but in terms of storytelling, like I think this guy, you're right, he's a professional, and and that kind of consistency is really great. And I think you see it in scenes like the date scene in this comic, where it's just kind of like reliable, good back and forth emotive characters. And, he's not super stylish like a Todd McFarlane. And I think in some instances he maybe could benefit from that. Like there's that big splash of Spider-Man swinging to the rescue in this, where it looks like his hip is disconnected. Like his leg is like way out there. And like, I'm not going to be a guy that knocks anatomy in a Spider-Man comic, because Lord knows Todd McFarlane like broke those rules a long time ago. But Nauck's stuff is way more grounded, so when he does go a little bit weird, it feels extra weird. But at the same time, I want to commend his inking style here. Like, I know his normal inking style. It does not look like this. And so leaning into the kind of more sketchy, thin lines of a horror comic and the more kind of cross-hatching, like, I think he was able to like show that he can change it up here and roll with the punches. This does not look like his Gwen Stacy comic. And so I really like that. What did you think about the colors here? Because this is a more muted palette than we're used to getting. Did they work for you?
I didn't have any issues with them. I mean, I mean, again, like everything was just pleasant enough to look at, from the pencils, the inks to the colors. Nothing stood out in an adverse way. I mean, why did you feel strongly about the muted palette, or in one way or the other, or?
Well, I mean, I just think it's worth mentioning because like Marcio Menyz has been a force on this book, and now we have a fill-in for him here. And I thought it was very good work. I think maybe it's a little over-rendered on top of like Nauck's more simplistic pencils. But I think that's something you could probably lay at the feet of most modern colorists, and doesn't necessarily just apply to Sonia. I did want to point out Caramanga lettering here. I think they're usually pretty great. I didn't love the choice he did on the Queen Goblin font on the final page. I thought it seemed like it had like one or two too many choices. It was like outlined, bolded,
right.
Also a weird font, and breaking out of the bubble. It was a little over rendered. And then there was that weird point, I don't know if you noticed this in the comic, where like Spider-Man is running away and he says, what have you gotten herself into in regards to Betty? And to me, I don't even know if that was a Caramanga mistake, more than it seemed like maybe it tried to say like, what has she gotten herself into? And when they tried to change it into like, what have you gotten yourself into? And it got lost somewhere in between. Editors didn't catch that one.
Allow myself to introduce myself, Dan. I mean, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right.
So,
well, it's count the typos, win a pony, right? I mean, I think that's just kind of how we do it these days in the Amazing Spider-Man. So, how was
nitpicky.
I mean, how was the synopsis page though? Did we at least get through that one unscathed today, or?
Yeah, the synopsis was okay, but I'll leave available Alan to message me later about how bad the grammar was, which he tends to do.
Awesome.
So, Mark, let's talk about the real stars of this comic coming back after a while out of the book, which is Chasm and Hollow's Eve. And I guess by that factor, also Queen Goblin. Like, these are really the, like, inventions of the Zeb Wells run, which, like the book, dislike the book. These are the kind of inventions of the run. What do you think of these characters and how they're handled in this particular chapter?
I mean, clearly, David Michelinie had Venom and Carnage, and Zeb Wells has Chasm and Hallows Eve and Queen Goblin. I mean, I think we could put them on the same pedestal there. I mean, look, since I saw the house ad for this issue, I was just kind of like, okay, brace yourself, Chasm is coming, and there was nothing about this issue outside of, and I talked about it in the recap. The Betty Jane joke made me laugh. I have to admit, like I was legitimately charmed by that joke. But this like even like Hallows Eve, it's just like it's a power set that like I feel like through every iteration gets kind of dulled and nullified a little bit in terms of like what is like it's just so goofy. I'm sorry. It's just and leading to the dumb jokes about my why are you calling my girlfriend a dog, and it's just like these characters these characters ain't great, Dan. I don't know what else to say. They're not great. Not necessarily looking forward to this per se. Nothing was like really over the top terrible in this issue, but I'm there is some foundation there for it to be in some future installments. I don't know what else to say. I hate to be that way, but
I kind of like these characters in their appearances outside of Amazing Spider-Man. Like I love the Web of Spider-Man thing that Steve Fox wrote, and like Greg Land illustrated. You're going to hear me like issue a positive credential to Greg Land
and Todd Nauck in the same episode. Right? What is happening here?
Yeah. What's going on here, guys? I mean, whatever. Greg Land, like for all of his tracing, he does like have a good cinematic sense of like composition, and like I like that little story of Chasm breaking out of limbo or wherever he was being held, if only just because he looked like dynamic in action, and that was kind of fun. And I liked Hallows Eve's, like one shots and miniseries. I thought that was fun too, but they are just weird characters, and like mostly because like the rules around them don't make any sense. Like, for Chasm and Hallows Eve, yeah. Queen Goblin, don't even get me started. Like, what is she now? She lost the sins of Norman, but she's still red and goblin-y, and like, so like Ashley Kafka, like, why is she like this? Maybe we're going to find out, like, there's that whole implication of Peter and Michelle, and there being some other side to Peter that's maybe calling up ex-girlfriends or whatever. Like, maybe we're going to find out that like losing the sins of Norman like is not so easily attained, but like it's hard to care or understand the status quo of these characters if the rules don't really ever seem to apply. And then I also feel like, are these villains? And maybe that's a good question to ask every Spider-Man villain, but especially these guys. These like are all like abused characters, and so in some way they like belong together. But like none of them have chosen to be here. Chasm's had his memory wiped and is like losing his mind, and so you're kind of rooting for him to heal himself. And like Hallows Eve is just kind of like a +1 to that story, which is to say like she wants him to heal himself. And then like Ashley Kafka, like I gotta feel bad for her. Like this like Queen Goblin persona made her sleep with Kraven, which like the implications of that I can't really get into. But even still, like how much autonomy does she have here and for what she's doing? I don't know. And so, I'm kind of rooting for these guys to heal themselves. One, because I'm not interested in them as characters necessarily, but also it just kind of feels icky. And so like my hope is next issue they're all healed and we can move on. But then you see something like there's this new Chasm and Kane book that was solicited, and it's like, well, maybe not.
Got to keep it churning, man. The people want Chasm. I don't know who those people are, but they want them, and we have to keep going.
Yeah, I want me some Mountain Dew Spider-Man.
There we
but,
go.
There we go. All right, Mark. Well, we're going to do something a little bit different today, which is talk about our Patreon in a middle ad here. All right, Mark, we're doing something a little bit different on our Patreon this week, and so I just wanted to use this time to kind of advertise it a little bit. Some of you may have heard our interview with Cody Ziegler that then kind of broke the internet, so to speak. I won't claim to have that kind of power, but it definitely went like much farther than a typical interview that we does, which is to say, all you dear listeners listen to it, and then I wish you'd share it, but you don't seem to, and so nobody hears about all the awesome stuff that's happening in the interview. But then this one blows up because I guess it invoked the name Kevin Feige, and the internet reacted how it was bound to react. And Mark and I thought we'd discuss it, not just for that, but also some of the like stuff that was implied in the interview and what it has to say about modern Spider-Man comics. Mark, do you want to add anything to this?
No, this is the kind of stuff you get when you sign up for our Patreon, right, Dan? I mean, hey, sometimes it's snippets of an interview. Sometimes it's I shouldn't say sometimes. It's always the reviews a little bit early, but also sometimes we can just kind of vamp and do our own thing. So, it's going to be a good spirited discussion about the state of Spider-Man comics and Marvel comics in general. Not to mention the daddy faye of it all, and come check it out on the Patreon.
Yeah, so go to AmazingSpiderTalk.com, and there's a big button for Patreon there that you can click on, and for $3.99 a month, you can gain access to our exclusive podcast on there, and you'll get to listen to this discussion of the Cody Ziegler interview. So go check it out. We'd love to have you be a part of our Patreon community. All right, let's get back to our review of Amazing Spider-Man Volume 6, number 47. Mark, I want to talk about this date that happens in this issue. I thought it was genuinely charming, but also kind of weird. I feel like this run, kind of is starting to move in a refreshing way towards more normal issues of Amazing Spider-Man as it's been. Like, it just kind of feels more casual and like, hey, let's bring Peter back into this and his supporting cast and spend half an issue doing something that maybe won't matter all that much and yet fleshes out his world. It's like a mode I'm not used to this comic operating under, where we've kind of been in more highfalutin, big major arcs, not to mention the Nick Spencer run where Peter kind of disappeared for 50 issues at a time. I found this refreshing. Maybe not full of substance, but I don't know. What did you make of this whole thing?
No, I definitely enjoyed it. I could do without back-to-back issues of Peter interacting with another woman and MJ being either with an earshot or on the other end of the phone or something. I mean, I feel if we truly want to start demonstrating maybe Peter is starting to heal and move on a bit, I think maybe separating him off from the MJ of it all would be a useful move for his character, quite frankly. But I thought the date was fine. I mean, it was a little awkwardly framed, and not just awkward in the sense that Peter is awkward, but I also just think it was some of the patter was a little awkward in a inorganic kind of awkward way. But at the end of the day, I did appreciate that. There did actually seem to be a connection there between the two of them, and then what undid it was the was the usual Spider-Man type antics, which is how it should be. You know what I mean? It's but in a simpler way. I know we want to see growth and evolution and all that. But at the end of the day, it's hard for Peter to maintain relationships because he's Spider-Man and has a responsibility to Spider-Man. So it was simple. It was effective. I'm all about seeing a second date here, or the recurrence of Shay. There was nothing about Shay here that I thought was like, oh, why this character seems difficult. No, it was good. I enjoyed it. So.
Yeah, and you mentioned it. I think this is a nice continuation of the themes of the run, which is like allowing Peter to move on from MJ. If you don't like that storyline, this is not going to win you over in any way. But like in that's the storyline of this run. This felt like a nice substantial like moment. I mean, I think you could probably look at this if you were being super cynical as like page filler, which is to say like, we've got to balance out this like chasm story with something else. And so I'll bring in this random character and, do something of very light substance. But like, I thought in terms thematically, it's like, okay, like it's not pointing at itself, to be like, look, he's healing. It just kind of felt like a nice life moves on. And this might be the result of it, as inorganic as it kind of felt. I don't know if this is roll out the ratchet gun moment for you, Mark.
No, it's not a ratchet gun.
No. So like, it at least meets that threshold. It's not a ratchet gun moment. And again, I thought the writing was clever. I love the bit of Peter saying she's like, it's actually kind of good to not be too good at dating. And Peter's like, well, then you've hit the jackpot here.
Right.
And like that kind of sincerity, I think it is fun. So,
yeah. I did find the dating is hard was a little bit of an odd way of phrasing it. But yes, I did think, I did appreciate Peter's kind of lovable put down of himself in that moment. So good times.
It's the kind of thing you kind of wished was more in Brand New Day. Like, for all the promises of moving on from MJ, there was very little actual dating or taking advantage of Peter being single in that long, era of the comic. And this is the kind of thing I think I at least expected from that era, is seeing Peter go on many dates and fail most of them, So, anyway.
Well, do we want to talk about the Betty and Ned of it all in this issue, Dan, or is there anything else you want to say about the date?
No, I think that's it. I want to talk about like this great storytelling trope, or like Deus Ex Machina, or whatever you want to call it. From this, and I know that it's a favorite of yours, Mark.
Yeah, I mean, you could say that this is a moment that truly jumps the shark. Would you say, Dan? Or hey,
that is the Winkler device.
Hey! I mean, like I just when you thought that we couldn't possibly go back to this, like you said, this Deus Machina. I mean, we're back, baby. I mean, it's Betty Brant snooping around warehouses. What's not to love, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, actually, to commend this, it's something I think Zeb does fairly well, which is to allow all of his various stories, whether you like them or not, like not commenting on the individual stories. I think he's fairly good at like finding ways to make the stories kind of dovetail into each other. Like I think the run can feel very scattered, but I do find it refreshing when elements of one story end up being important elsewhere. Like, of course, the Winkler device from the Hobgoblin story is going to be used to heal Chasm. Like, that just makes sense. Like, and of course, Chasm would go to Ashley Kafka for therapy. I mean, like, there was a history there, and, now we've got a demented Ben Reilly and a demented therapist, Like, to me, that is a commendable skill of a writer weaving together a run like this.
Yeah, no, it all makes sense. There's no threads here that are just like, wait, how are we getting from here to there? I mean, like, like, maybe this was not the story we were all asking for, but at least the foundation has been planted, or whatever you want to say. I'm mixing metaphors, but I do that well.
Yeah, and also I loved that, like, the shout out to Kingsley having a special hatred for Betty.
Right.
You know, especially dating back to their Hobgoblin Lives days. And, you know, to me it helps elevate Betty and makes it feel natural that she's in this place more than it might otherwise. That being said, how Betty doesn't know that Peter is Spider-Man after interactions like this is completely beyond me. But, you know, like... suspension of belief there a little bit on this. Personally, I hope Spider-Man just goes, let me sit down and give you my memories, Ben, because like the torture of like this ongoing storyline for Ben, I'm like well past it. Just fix that character and move on. That's my hope out of all of this.
No, we need Kane versus Chasm, Dan. So you will not get your wish, okay? So
no, I never do.
The beatings will continue until morale improves, okay, Dan? I mean...
Speaking of beatings, I actually thought it was a really cool moment where Spidey like shot that guy with the web and then used his leg to pull the web into the ground and slam him down. Like, if that was a Todd Nauck addition to the script, like, bravo. Yeah. I've never seen that before in a Spider-Man comic. And I thought it was cool.
Especially considering he did it to not Frank Castle. I mean, it was just like a magical moment of synergy there, you know? Like, 'cause, you know, the real Frank Castle, that wouldn't have happened to.
I mean, anyway. You joke, but when was the last time we saw legit just... you know, like faceless goons in the pages of a Spider-Man comic? Like,
oh, for sure.
Sure. Sign me up for more. Let the beatings continue on these faceless goons.
All right. Well, you know, I know you already did the speaking of beatings transition. So, how about speaking of faceless goons? What's your grade on this comic? I don't know. I'm trying here, folks.
I don't even know how to dignify that with a response, but. This one's a solid C minus for me. Let's just say C.
I'm right there with you. I'm giving it a C. I won't even dignify it with a minus. How's that sound?
I mean, that's just an average Spider-Man comic for you.
Average, totally acceptable art and story and grade. There we go.
There we go. All right, Mark, why don't you take us home?
Well, it's that time for all good things to come to an end. So we want to say thank you to you, the listeners and viewers, for tuning in to this episode of The Amazing Spider Talk.
Yeah, this podcast exists because of listener support on Patreon. For only $3.99 a month, you can help support our show's existence while getting early episodes, including these reviews the same weeks the comics release, exclusive artwork, and a ton of other bonuses, like Mark and Maya's follow-up discussion on that Cody Ziegler interview. So a thank you to everyone who already supports us in the work that we do. Plus, we wanted to extend a special thanks to our newest contributors, Eric Linden and Joshua Leninger. I probably butchered his name, but I did my best, Joshua, so I apologize.
Better you than me, Dan. Dan and I really want to increase all the awesome work we do in 2024. So if you are already a patron or want to become one, please help us to meet our goals and to make this a better podcast by considering supporting our show. Just go to AmazingSpiderTalk.com and click on that big old Patreon button to get started.
And, you know, the Cody Ziegler interview is an example of this. Like, your support on Patreon helps us get major big guests like Cody on the show, and hopefully they'll come back, although that seems increasingly dubious. Anyway, it's been a little bit since we've done a Substack, a couple weeks, Mark, but that doesn't mean it's not worth subscribing to. If you want to follow all of Mark and my additional thoughts in writing this time about Spider-Man, actually the medium we love participating in, go to amazingspider.substack.com to sign up. So, Mark, until you discover that I've used the Winkler device to get you to say that annuals count, and I'm erasing this from your memory right now, what's our motto?
Hey! With great podcasts, there must also come the Amazing Spider Talk.